Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are on our fantastic planet. And welcome to this week's, well, not this week's, we didn't do one last week, every other week. Welcome to this live stream this week, focused on how do we change culture? And more importantly, the big question is who changes the culture? So we're massively excited. I tend to say that usually at each one of these live streams, but I am genuinely excited about this one, particularly because this is something that is such a huge issue for every organization, every manager that we ever come across. So again, very excited to be here for this week's live stream. And we're going to focus very much on how do we change the culture? And more importantly, we're going to zero in on who is important in changing the culture of the organization. So a massive thank you to so many of you who are joining the stream. We've got very different channels coming in from X to Facebook, Instagram. I think this is on YouTube as well as here on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is our primary focus. So thank you wherever you've come from to arrive at this live stream for this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you are. If you don't know us, don't know me, my name is Wayne Clark. I'm here from the World Class Manager team in a unusually sunny London. It feels like summer's coming, so we're quite excited about that. And I'm the very lucky front man of this World Class Manager team, and we get to work with companies all around the world. So our focus for this live stream, and we like to start with a very clear intent, is helping you to make what we call build robust business cases for change. It's not a very exciting acronym, BRB, CFC, build robust business cases for change. And what we're doing is sharing with you some of our insights, some of our data and research from working with managers all around the world. So if this is valuable for you, then it should be because that you're going to be in a senior position in an organization and you are focused on delivering change. You are in a way you've been asked to deliver change for the organization, and you're in a senior role. So hopefully much of what we're going to share with you in terms of the insights, the stories, the data is going to be really relevant for you, not just because it's interesting, but because we want it to be valuable and help you to build a really robust business case for change. If you're more junior in the organization, or you're a manager, or you want to become a manager one day, then we hope many of the things we're going to share with you during this live stream are going to be relevant for you as well. And this is hugely important for us because we are tremendously market driven. If you interact with me or with us on social media, particularly on LinkedIn, you'll know we're constantly polling and asking questions, and we do that for a reason, and you'll see why, because some of the data is tremendously valuable in helping us to gauge what's important for people, and also it's the way that we built our program. So again, if you don't know much about us, we built the World Class Manager program. We've now delivered, I guess, more than 100,000 managers around the world have been through our program of some description in more than 38 countries, and everything we do, how we develop our content, how we deliver the content is very much market driven. So we like to react to what people want. And this whole live stream is actually a reaction to a poll that we put out a few weeks ago, which was asking a question about who do we think as a LinkedIn community genuinely drives the change in the organization. So I'm going to share with you the data on that a little bit later, as well as much of the data from what we found in our journey. As I've said, 100,000 managers have been through our programs of some description. And what we've been doing is looking at some quite compelling data. We've got data on about 15,500 managers. So what I'll be sharing with you during this session is based on our primary research, based on our data, based on the insights that we're picking up from working with managers all around our wonderful planet. Now, all of the managers that we've come across, regardless of whether they are more junior in an organization, more senior in the organization, tend to have a very similar issue. And the similar issue, of course, is looking at culture change. Often the organization wants the manager to play an instrumental role in driving the change, but we found out that it's not necessarily just managers, which leads us to this very short intro where we're asking this question for this week's live stream on who changes culture. Now, I think we should probably do a roll call before we get started because we've got people dialed in from all over. So thank you so much for those of you who are connected in from South Africa. I believe we've got people in here from UAE, from Saudi Arabia, from Mongolia. I think there's someone in from Australia as well, and also from the US. For those from the US, I'm impressed because it's very early in the US. So thank you very much for joining the live stream from the US. But again, a huge thank you for those who have joined during the session. If you've just joined, I'm not going to try and recap all the intro, but the whole focus of this is how do we improve the culture of the organization? How do we drive culture change, which is really important. And we're going to look specifically at who is key in driving that culture change as well. So where do we start? Well, usually with these live streams, we sort of do them off the cuff. And this wasn't the case today because there was so much info, so much data, so much insights I wanted to try and share. I've actually created some structure for sharing this stuff with you, which is, if you know me, it's very unlike me. So I wanted to get into, I guess, the sort of core here of where do we start? And let's maybe look at a structure. Let's look at a very simple structure for how we drive cultural change. And let's look at some of the key elements that are important. And let's maybe start with some of the who, why, what, where, when, how. I think that's 6, right? There's usually 6 questions, but let's start with some of this. Let's start with probably the important one, which is why. And this is one of the hardest ones to agree on. If you watch some of the previous live streams, we shared a video of a guy called Colonel Ed Guthrie from the US military. And Colonel Ed Guthrie talks about the US military's after action review process, which essentially revolves around 4 very simple questions. What was supposed to happen? What actually happened? Why was there a difference in between those two? And what can we do differently next time? 4 brilliant, simple questions to ask at the end of a project, to really engage the team and find out what we've learned. He says the hardest question to agree on is the first question: what was supposed to happen? So why are we doing this in the first place? And often this is one of the reasons why most people are quite mystified about why the change is even taking place. They just don't know. So let's start with the why. Let's look at why we might want to drive culture change. So it could be that we're trying to either maintain something, or it's probably that we're trying to improve something. Let's look at the employee angle. It's likely that most people have said in an employee survey that we need to change our employee culture. We need to change the engagement status of the organization to some degree. So that could be a way that this is driven. Actually, we've got some data here. We asked a question on LinkedIn, which says, what do you think is the most likely driver for change? 25% said customer client feedback, 52% said employee feedback, 15% public opinion. And I guess what I was aiming at in asking that question was, is this stakeholders? Is this investors, another group? And then some people commented on some other things. So it could be that we're aiming to drive and change and improve how it feels to work here, the employee experience, the employee culture. So that could be one key element of why we're trying to drive a culture change. The second could be that we're trying to do something that impacts how our customers and our clients feel about our organization. So a typical one, excuse me, would be looking at something like driving the customer experience. How do we improve the customer experience? How do we get our customers or our clients or both to change their opinion of the experience that they get from our products or our services? This is often a huge driver. It can be because we've genuinely listened to what the customer is saying. My experience, based on looking into all the companies we've come across, and we've now worked with more than 1,000 organizations in more than 30 countries, I think most companies are quite bad at being able to aggregate and learn from the volume of customer insight data that they actually have. And I'll prove my point in a few things we'll talk about a bit later. So one element here could be about the employee feedback. The second element could be around how we're trying to drive a change for our customer or our client feedback. And then the third thing could be around something like commercial growth. So it might be that you're trying to drive a change in the organization, a culture change, which results in growth, could be more sales. If you're a housing association, it could be driving more impact for the residents. And if you're from outside the UK, we're really talking about social housing providers. If you think about the NHS Trust, or again, if you're outside of the UK, if we think about our healthcare services, we probably want to improve the provision of patient care for the people that the hospitals and our doctors and nurses are there to serve. And in order to drive that, we might need some sort of cultural change to take place. So the outcome could be profit, it could be growth, it could be sales, it could be social impact. If you're an NGO, of course, you're probably more concerned with driving social impact more than anything else. So when we think about the drivers for change and why are we doing this, why might there need to be a cultural change? It could be a number of those things or many others, but I just wanted to touch upon 3 key things here. The key, though, when you look at all of that, whether we're talking about employee change, employee engagement change, customer experience change, driving growth change, whatever the change is, it requires one key word. And there's one common word in all of this, isn't there? Which is change. And it's hard to get change. So even if let's simplify this for a minute. We're getting too lofty. We're getting too global. Let's go super local. Let's talk about us as individuals and the people in our lives. It's hard enough to change in a relationship or to change your relationship with something that you do. It could be fitness, could be nutrition, it could be timekeeping. There's all sorts of things that we want to change. And it's not hard. It's not easy to change things. It's often quite hard to change things. And it's not hard to change things for the short term, but it's hard to change things for the long term, because no one wants something that peters out, right? We don't want profit this year. We want to make consistent, sustainable, growing profits every year, because that's what most companies want. We don't just want to improve or impact the customer experience for the rest of the year, do we? We want to do that ongoing forever, because that's our focus. To get consistent change to happen is really difficult. And it's one of the really big things that we look at, because we need to get people to do things differently, think differently, act differently. And getting people to change, or even again, think about it personally, changing yourself is hard enough to achieve, let alone when you've got thousands of people across the organization. I'll illustrate this because we met a guy who was a cardiologist, or is a cardiologist. And one of his pieces of research was looking at how many men following a heart attack changed their behavior. So this is a significant moment in anyone's life. If you've had a heart attack and then following the heart attack, how many men, and he was studying men specifically, it may be better with women, but with men, how many men would change their behavior following a heart attack? I don't know what percentage you think this might be, but I was quite shocked. I thought it would be around 50%. And he said to me it was 21%. 21% of men following heart attacks, according to his research, changed their behavior following the heart attack, i.e. they ate better, they exercised a bit more, they did something different, they changed, and they changed in a way for kind of like for the long term. What he said to me was that 100 people, of course, want to change. Only 21%, based on his experience, were able to change. Now, to put this into context, and the reason why I think this is important is because I was talking with him about behavioral change in organizations based on our experiences and on our work. And he sort of stopped me dead in my tracks and said, you don't know what you're talking about. I've been studying men who've had heart attacks for years. Getting people to change their behavior is unbelievably difficult. So when we think about that in the context of the organization, and we're asking this really big question, how do we get people to do things differently? Now, let's assume, we're going to make a few assumptions here just to try and create a bit of a model to think this through. Let's assume that we were able to get someone to change the way that they do things, and successfully. So you're a manager, you've got people in your team, you're talking to Fred, and you're going to get Fred to change the way that he does things. You need to make sure that we're delivering for our customer in a way that we've never delivered before, which means that Fred might need to be more proactive in the engagement with customers. It might mean that he really needs to make a step change in how he understands what the customer wants. There's all sorts of things that we could look at, but you've managed to change how Fred engages with this particular situation. And the client or the customer on the other side of the table is now saying, actually, yeah, I'm getting a better service from this organization. Job done. Excellent. Brilliant. You've managed to change one person. Let's compound this across an organization. Let's call it 10,000 people. We know how hard it is to achieve change with one person, but there's still 9,999 to go. And if you've got an organization of 10,000 people, let's assume, and you could really apply this to any scale of company, you could assume that we've probably got 1,000 people every year who will leave or be refreshed in the organization, right? People leave, people join, roughly around 10%. So you've got this added sort of compounded problem of a large population of the entire population are refreshed every single year, which requires a reinduction, a recommunication, a sort of re-narrativization. That's a new word for you, around how do we get as many people as possible to understand the narrative. So idea really is that it's impossible to try and get, if you are the CEO, the CFO, the chief people officer, you're in a senior role in the organization, it's impossible, of course, to try and get to everyone. We know that we're never going to be able to achieve that because it's just not possible to do it. And the big question that we're looking at then is, if in a complex, large situation, and that could be any size really of organization, we're asking the question of what might be the conduit, as we talk about. Who is the conduit? What is the conduit in order to get a number of people at scale to be able to start to think differently, do things differently, act differently in order to drive any sort of change in the organization? Who is the conduit? Now, of course, we're biased based on our research, based on our insights, based on my work personally all around the world and the rest of the team, is how do we focus on this? We think it's to do with the manager. We think that the manager is probably your best bet. Can't think of another group of people in the organization who could play a proactive role to drive culture change in any organization. the question that we also like to ask is how well engaged or how involved are the managers in this whole process of trying to understand what this culture change might need to be. Interesting. We'll come back to that. Now, when we look at this, let's assume that around 10 to 20% of your organization are managers, depending on what type of structure and how your organization's been designed. That means that we've probably got around 80 to 90% of the population who aren't managers, which you might think, Wayne, this is really basic stuff you're talking about. It is very basic stuff, but it's one of the really interesting things I kept coming across time and time again with CEOs who were aiming to drive an engagement culture change in their organization. So I'll give you a quick story. So we worked with a guy who was the leader of a business who had around 4,500 people. They're a FTSE 250 listed company. And it was interesting because he was saying to me he wanted to be top 20 on the Sunday Times best companies to work for, right? So I was talking with him about how that might happen, how you could achieve such a thing. And I was saying you probably need around, 3,500 to 4,000 of the staff right now to change their opinion in how they feel about you, the leadership team, and all these other different measures that all of us will measure in engagement. It was fascinating because what he was focused on was the 300 to 400 managers. I said, yeah, of course we've got 300 to 400 managers, but we've got, 4,000 people who aren't managers in the organization. In order to get any sort of engagement culture change, you need to get as many as possible of those 4,000 to change their opinion on what it feels like to come to work every day. Let's sort of wrap it up in our modern language, right? We call this the employee experience. If the employee experience doesn't change, people don't vote next time a survey comes around saying things have got better. So when we look at this and we look at the percentage of people in the organization who we really need to get to, it's probably around the 80 to 90%, which is why the conduit has to be the manager. The manager is our way in to try and get to as many people as possible in the organization. So now think about all those managers. We've got this 10,000 people organization. We've got, let's call it 2,000 managers in the organization that represent, every sort of structure and type of manager from more junior to more senior. Now we ask the question, how well involved how well involved is the manager community when it comes to thinking through whatever change might be needed? So again, you're the CEO, you've sat there, you've thought about the change that's needed. We need to drive a culture change in how we engage our people. We need to drive a culture change in how we deliver for our customer and improve the customer experience. Or we need a much more commercially focused organization, and that's the culture change that we need to enact. How much involvement do those 1,000 to 2,000 managers have in that process of working through the design of what that culture change needs to be? I would argue in most companies we come across, and not to be too brutal, because I'm conscious we've got people that we work with from organizations I'm kind of got in mind when I'm talking about this on the line, but it's the truth. We're all adults. It's an adult situation. I think it's very, very low. I don't know what the percentage number would be, but I would argue it's low. The number of managers who would be involved and would understand the narrative for change in the same way that the leadership team do would be unbelievably low compared to the population of the leadership team or the top 50 or the top 100. Right. Remember, in a 10,000 person organization, for example, we've got another few thousand managers out there. And if you picked managers at random and asked them to talk to you about what they think the narrative for change is, it would be very low. I've had direct experience in many of the companies we've worked in. And what you often find is a headline or a headline sort of number or a headline sort of statement about growth, which you're thinking, yeah, it is about growth, but what does that actually mean in practice? People can't really explain to you. So again, what happens is the messaging falls away unbelievably quickly. And then we ask the question, to what extent are managers involved in this process? They're not really. It's very, very low. Looking at it another way based on our insights is what percentage of managers actually want to be engaged in this process. I would argue it's unbelievably high. And I've got evidence. We've got proof in this. Now, we found out from our research, and this is based on 15,500 managers that we've looked at and worked with in more than 30 countries. 81% of managers around the world have said conclusively that they believe the products or services of their organization could be better. I mean, it's an unbelievably high number. 81% of managers believe the products or services of the organization could be better. Now, this was mind-blowing for us when we really looked at the data, because what we think about in an employee engagement process is we're asking lots of interesting questions about lots of interesting things. What we're often not getting to is the operational improvement that the organization probably wants to benefit from. Who's best to contribute those ideas and those thoughts? Probably the managers. And we know that 81% of managers feel that there's a better way. if you've been party to see your employee feedback en masse on sort of an aggregated scale, you will, I'm sure, agree that there are lots of really exceptionally valuable comments that are locked up in the verbatim comments of the survey. But how do you get at that stuff, and how do you sort of make sense of that at an organizational level, especially when you've got thousands and thousands of people? So we know for sure that about 81% of managers believe that the products or services could be better, and they definitely want to make a contribution. So as we would argue, 81% of managers definitely want to make an impact. So which leads us to another question to think about, which is, so then are all managers equal? Well, if we've got these 1,000, 2,000 managers, awesome. Let's just switch it on. Let's get everyone engaged and fired up, and we're off on the journey. We're going to drive the change. If it was that simple, there'd be no need to debate these issues around culture change and why it's hard to drive a culture change, for a few key reasons. Some we're going to get into now. Now, this is interesting for us because when we've looked at this, and sorry, my answer to this question would be, are all managers equal when it comes to driving culture change? My answer would be absolutely not. They're absolutely not equal, not because of any equality issue, but because of the fact that some people care disproportionately more or less than other human beings. And this has got nothing to do with the organization. It's probably got everything to do with the individual and things to do with what they went through in life as well and how they see the world. So when we've looked at this, I'll give you a few examples, 3 examples actually. One is looking at an accounting company, and this was fascinating for me. So this organization is a highly successful organization. They have around 300 managers, and I watched as the senior or the managing partner of the organization wrote a letter to 300 managers. Now, this is interesting because at the point in their evolution, they're at the sort of most engaged point they've ever been. They've been doing, plus 20% organic growth year on year. So everyone's getting well paid. The bonuses are full. And a letter gets written to 300 managers from the managing partner of the organization to essentially say, look, let's use Fred again. Dear Fred, we've got a really sort of challenging change program ahead of us, and we're giving some deep thought and consideration to our strategic change plans. I would love to involve you in that. If you would like to be involved, please just let me know, say yes, and I'll send you some more information. If you don't want to be involved, you're doing a great job. Keep doing what you're doing, Fred. And, they were very careful not to bias the response from the managers. This letter was sent to 300 managers, and 27 managers came back and said, yes, they would like to be involved in the next sort of strategic change of the organization. And this was mind blowing for me when I was looking at this, because they were, one of the highest engaged sort of professional service firms I'd ever seen in action. And of the 300 managers, we've got this sort of perfect 10% of the population who wanted to make an impact and wanted to make a difference. Right. So next organization is a bank. And this was fascinating again, because I got to see the top 100 future talent in action. All the 100 were there. They were asked a couple of questions by the CEO. The CEO shared the strategy of the bank over the next few years, all very exciting. And if you are in the top 100, of course, this is a great place to be. You're engaging personally with the CEO. At the end of the session, I was involved in this, we asked 2 very simple questions. One question was, now you've understood the strategy, what one thing can you do to make an impact on this? And the second question was, how would you make that thing happen? So very simple questions. We got them to fill out these cards and put them in a box at the end of the session. At the end of the session, we had around 45 people who'd filled out these cards. We sent an email to the 55 people who didn't fill out a card, and we got 3 emails back. So it's pretty conclusive. Then we invited the 48 people to a session a few weeks later, not invited by me, but invited by the CEO of the organization. And then of the 45 people who were invited, we got 18 essentially who showed up at the end. So again, you can do the maths on this. It's definitely nowhere near 50%. We're probably around 20% of the manager population. Third example, and I'm sure you got the pattern by now, is looking at a media company and 900 people who were invited to be part of this really exciting process of change for the future of the organization. And of the 900 people who are invited, again, very good organization, well paid, enjoyable work, high employee engagement scores in their internal survey. 126 people of the 900 who were asked to get involved got involved. So again, this for me was mind blowing, because, we were asking, is there a pattern here? Well, there absolutely is a pattern. And the pattern is that we've got a population of people who tend to be more interested than others. And here I think is a really important question to ask is, who is that who are those people and how do we identify what we call the willing? How do we identify the people who genuinely want to make an impact and contribute something a bit more, which I think is something really interesting to look at. Because many organizations kind of assume that we've got a culture change, we're just going to drive something and it's going to work and people are going to be interested in it, or it's going to impact, everyone across the organization and everyone will be interested. It's not the case. What we genuinely need to do is to work out who are the people who care a bit more than other people, and then work probably a bit closer with them. And this is giving us a very clear indication, I think, of how we need to drive the change and who's important. So this one was interesting for us as well, is this thinking about then how do we create a reason for those people to step forward? Again, based on the idea that what percentage of people, and I don't know, we've never looked at the data on this, but what percentage of the population are truly altruistic, that will do something for the greater good just because they absolutely love this organization or the industry and want to do something great for it? I think it's a low percentage of the population. Most people, most human beings are motivated by selfish outcomes. And that could be that you want to do charitable work because you feel great. That's a selfish outcome, but you're doing something great, of course. So most people have a selfish driven bent or trait towards how they think about the world and how they think about building their own value. And of course, what we now need to do is work out, how do we marry that? How do we meet you as the individual to say, right, here's a bit of a promise. Here's something that we could involve you in that's going to make you worth more internally and externally in the market. And also there's a sort of a deal here. There's something that we really could benefit from you when it comes to thinking about what we might need in order to drive change. So the first thing that we look at is how do we identify what we call the willing of the organization, and how do we create a reason for them to step forward? And I think this is really important. And what we found out from, again, some of these experiences and some of these experiments is we can do this quite effectively if we can figure out what might be a compelling reason for people to want to step forward. As a quick side story on this, I worked with about 300 young students aged 16 to 19 when I just left university. I started working for Arthur Andersen, or Deloitte as it was, or as it became. And then I got to work with a number of young students across London, talking with them about their future, their careers, and so on. And my challenge was at the end of each session, because I had about 30 young people there and a number of friends of mine got involved in this, was who do I decide to coach? Because I want to coach everyone if I could do it, but I just don't have the time to do it. But I'd love to coach a number of people who came to this session. And then I figured out at the end of the session, if I had 30 young people there would be like 2 or 3 people at the end who'd stay behind. And I noticed, again, the pattern for this happened time and time and time again. The 2 to 3 people who stayed behind at the end weren't the ones who were often very vocal during the session. But I sort of realized, well, and you may argue this is a really naive way to look at it, but I figured maybe those are the 2 or 3 people who I should give some more time to and get into a bit more of a coaching relationship with. And that's something that I did consistently over time. It's something I still do, even with the universities where we lecture. You're going to find that there's a few people who stay at the end who are, a bit more inquisitive. They want a bit more curious. They want to understand a bit more and get involved. And the challenge for us is, how do we identify who those people are and create what we would say is a really, compelling reason to step forward. Next step on this journey is, how do we then, so let's assume that we've figured out that there's a population of managers, because we think managers are really important, that we want to engage with this process. We've got the population of managers together. We've identified the population of the manager population who are really interested in making a change and driving this change. So we've figured out the who now. Now our challenge is, what do we do with this talent, with this energy, with this passion? And here's the key again. Often what happens is we make these huge assumptions that across the organization, something's going to work. And I'm a massive advocate, I'm sure you employ this in your organization too, of what we would call the test and learn approach. So to identify something quite small, quite short term, in terms of something that you can demonstrate a change on in the short term, because it feels great to actually see change happen. Identify some of those people who are willing to get involved, and then set them after a challenge to try and solve something. My window that we love to work on, I love to look at a 90-day window. Is there something that we could do to drive a change in 90 days in a particular part of the organization that would tell us, A, if this actually works, B, if the change is going to succeed across the organization, and I think C, probably more important than anything, what can we learn that might be applicable for the rest of the organization? Because it's painful to try and drive change in any organization at scale and figure out partway in this is the wrong way. And you're only going to know the right way by figuring out the right way through a test and learn process. So that's key. Second thing to this then is working out in terms of what we would call success measures. So how do you judge whether or not this change is successful or would be successful? What are the outcomes that we're looking for to see whether the change in employee experience is actually working, the change in the customer experience is working? In terms of growth, and it could be that you're driving sales, but in some organizations, you can drive the wrong type of sales, the wrong type of customers. And we've seen this in many examples. We worked with another organization who lost a customer who were representing 60% of their annual turnover. I mean, it was an absolute devastating moment for the organization. So if you looked at the strategy, I mean, it was flawed because no one had ever really thought through this is a dangerous situation to be in. So again, you can drive growth, but it might not be the right mix of clients that you want or the right type of organization. So all of these things, we're thinking what might be an important outcome to think about. So in order to prepare for this session, we've got a few outcomes just to discuss and think about that I wanted to share with you. So a couple here. Actually, I've got five of what I would call the success measures. So, and this is interesting. So one of the interesting things here is obviously there are numerical measures, right? We can say this is going to be a success because we can put a pound or a dollar or a euro or a real mark against it, which is going to tell us whether this is a success or not. In many cases, things are hard to quantify that way. So there are a few other things to think about. One organization that we worked with has a number of food depots. I met the general manager of one of the food depots who talked to me about how he was aiming to change the culture of the organization. And one of the things that he'd looked at was the number of bottles of alcohol that get stolen by staff. And he'd managed to reach a point in the culture evolution of the company where nothing got stolen anymore. And I just thought it was a wonderful way to look at, if you're trying to measure a culture of trust and that trust now exists, and you think that's so important in order to build the right type of empathic culture in the organization, then having people not steal things is a pretty good measure of the fact that the culture is changing. So I think it's easy to fall into those hard numerical measures and actually not that helpful sometimes. It's helpful to try and look at what might be some of the signs of success. So it could be that you're going to look at something and say, actually, less alcohol stolen would be a pretty good measure of cultural improvement and culture change in that organization. The second thing that you might look at is how long does it take to bring people into the organization, or as we would term it, how do you welcome people into your organization? Often the time to induct people is fraught with issues. It doesn't work very well. The idea of what we sell in terms of the employee proposition or the employee value proposition often falls apart on day one because it's not been thought through. So in terms of the time to induct new people, that could be a specific measure of how you want to look at a cultural improvement or a culture change in the company. 3 is an obvious one, and also we can measure this financially, is how we might need to look at reducing labor turnover. In some organizations, turnover can be seen as too low, it can be seen as too high. And to what degree can we change that? One of the organizations that we worked with have around 11,000 people who leave the organization every year. We looked at the leaver data and we found out that about 50% of the people who leave the organization leave because they say that there are limited opportunities for them to learn and grow, which is mind-blowing given that they employ around 50,000 people. So when you think about it, are there limited opportunities in the company? Absolutely not. What we know of, though, is that the quality of the relationships and the conversations that line managers have with their teams are quite lousy, actually, if you look at it. Not because they're lousy managers, but because it's just never been seen as an important thing. They don't talk about it enough. They don't have these really important touch points in place. So therefore, things fall apart. There isn't this regular sort of engagement between the manager and the team. And therefore, people say there are limited opportunities to learn and grow, and I'm going to go somewhere else with my skills and my talent. So, reducing labor turnover can tell us a lot. And actually, there are many, as we all know, as people professionals or people passionate about the people agenda, there are many things that we can do to impact this. Number 4 is something interesting as well of how do you connect your organization with the world? So it might be as a change, as a culture change, you're trying to get a number of people across your organization to do a way better job or a way more involved job of articulating the value of this organization to the world. Now, I think it's a pretty strong measure that someone would be willing to, of their own accord, talk about how great the company is or share the success stories or share some of the strategic change narrative of the company on social media channels. This is really important for many organizations for many reasons. And if you think about your employee workforce, we have a company we were with last week that have around 1,000 people. They've probably got, I don't know, 20 to 30 people across the organization who are active on social media, especially on LinkedIn. If they had 100 or 200 people active, I mean, by order of magnitude of the impact that would have in terms of their social media reach would be unbelievable. So again, this could be a really interesting measure to look at. Is the culture change working, and how do we measure that? One measure could be looking at the social interaction online. And then a fifth one, just to think about, is an obvious one, perhaps, which is to look at how this might impact the increase in sales. So what might we need to do in order for sales to be the outcome? And we're not going to get into that. There's a million things that we can probably look at. But I think that this is an interesting set of things to potentially look at. As a final thing, in terms of some of the data here for us, is that we found that about 42% of managers, and this is quite shocking, I think, 42% of managers do not know what the goal of the organization is. So the idea that we've got this population of managers out there who understand what the goal is and are willing to drive this sort of culture change, whatever it might be, employee, customer growth, is an absolute fallacy. 42% based on the 15,500 managers that we've spoken to, do not understand what the goal of the organization is, which probably gives us a great indication of where we might need to start. Go all the way back up to the top. One of my first messages in this session was around clarifying what this is all about. Why is there a need to drive this change? What's the narrative? How do we engage the managers in this? I think here gives us a pretty good indication of what we might need to do. Let's get as many managers as possible to actually understand what this is all about and what role they could play in this. Now, I've saved this slide till the end because this is based on the original LinkedIn poll question that we asked a couple of weeks ago, which really spurred the whole idea of this entire live stream. So thank you very much for the 202 people who engaged with this poll. And the question was, how do you change a toxic culture? We were talking about toxic cultures in previous live streams. 32% have said leaders, 5% managers, 62% said anyone who's willing. Of course, that involves everyone, and 1% said someone else. Now, I thought this was interesting because 62% of the population, based on this survey, have said that this is really about anyone who's willing, which absolutely backs up all of our research, all of our insights into that there is always a population of people out there who care disproportionately more than others. The trick is working out who those people are and how we can engage them and how we can offer something of value to really leverage their skills, their talents, their experiences for the good of whatever this change sort of focus is based on. So as a quick summary, a couple of things, and hopefully we've got a few questions. I did write out to about 130 people who'd registered for the live stream, which was an effort. I'm not the fastest typer in the world, but 130 people to ask what some of their thoughts and challenges were. And we had a good few come back. So if you contributed back to that email, thank you very much. And as much as possible, we like to try and engage with you before, during, and after this process, which is how we make these live streams better for everyone. So there was some really good insights. And I think we've got one of the team on the line. I think Ash is on the line somewhere, probably looking at some of these insights that came back, and hopefully we can get into some questions. But if you do have any questions, then please feel free to share. Before we get into that, a couple of thoughts. So just as a quick summary, and I think, you can do your own job of summarizing this, but just from my own sort of thoughts, because this is such a broad church, this is such a huge area to get into. When we talk about driving culture change and who drives the culture change, I think I've pretty much made our case for who we think is important and how you get to those people. But culture change is such a huge issue. So what are the key things that we focus on? So number one, I would argue, we know that let's take the managers being involved as a given. I think this is important. No one's going to agree that it's not important. I don't think anyway. So number one, let's involve the managers as early as possible in the change process. And that could be as simple as a discussion forum, however, which way you're going to decide to do it. I think involving the managers is key. Number two is what we would call identifying the willing. How do you identify? And I think you've probably got at best 10 to 20% tops of the organization who care passionately about doing something a bit further for the organization and it forwarding itself, and therefore would be willing to play a role in any sort of change program. I don't think identifying change champions by pointing at people and saying, I nominate Dave and Mary in our team because I think they'd be a great change champion. Often I think that's an absolute disaster and a waste of time, because the process of nominating people is fraught with issues and bias. The best way that we've ever seen that always works is create a reason for people to step forward rather than nominate people. So create some real reasons for people to step forward and identify what we would call as the willing. Number three is to look at what I would argue are the test measures. So how do you measure for success? How do you know that this thing is on its way to work? What early signs of success might you see? The test and learn process, I would argue, point number 4, is a mechanism to do it. And I would focus on this 90-day change cycle to look at how you do that in the short term. And then the 5th thing I would argue is how we make this as easy as possible for anyone to engage with. I mean, let's face the reality of the world. We're all fundamentally busy. No one's got time. Our attention spans are shot to death. How do we get as many people as possible to engage in anything? We know it's got to do with how we make something really easy for people. There's a lady who I saw on YouTube who is 18 years old in the US. And you can check this out. It's fascinating to look at the research she's done. But she's looked at how she could make anything go viral on the internet. And she'd studied like thousands of videos that this guy called Mr. Beast, who's one of the biggest YouTubers, had created. And she was studying the messages that he was putting in these videos, like second by second. It's phenomenal what she was doing. What she was then doing was writing content and putting it into a readability age checker and dumbing down the content to get to grade 5. Right. So if you think about grade 5 readership age, and this was the idea, not because people are stupid, but because people are time poor. How do we communicate things in a way that is just easy to engage with? Often what happens in organizations is the change process, the messaging is quite complex. It requires a lot of cerebral thought to engage with it. And who's got the time to do that? Now, remember, as we've talked about on previous live streams, however good your message is, you are in competition, with this. So I'm on my phone, looking at, oh my God, something happened on social media. Justin Bieber's got some new trainers, LOL, I'm commenting on stuff. This is the sort of thing which is taking my attention away all the time. And therefore you are competing with this. So the key when we think about this is make this as easy as possible for anyone to engage with. Based on everything we've seen, now of the 1,000 organizations we've worked with, of the more than 100,000 managers across the world who've, I guess, engaged with our process and our programs. Actually, we've been doing some work with a phenomenally large organization, public sector organization, and that number's going to jump to about 200,000 managers who have benefited and been through our programs of some description. So we're learning a lot about what managers really need from all of this. And I think when we think about this, the role of the manager is tough. The challenges in terms of the demands on the modern manager are ever increasing. We're expected to be, an ESG expert, a DE&I expert. I was interviewed a few weeks ago on a Fertility Matters podcast about fertility conversations that managers are not prepared to have with members of their team who might be either trying to build or have had challenges in building a family. I mean, these are things that you're definitely not equipped for as a manager. On top of that, I've got my work, my day job, all my own workload. I've got the challenges in the team. I've got all the other stuff I've got going on outside of work, as well as now something hits me wave after wave of change in an organization. So, I think to be respectful and empathic to the challenge of the modern manager is a really important thing. And I think how we contextualize any change, whether that's internal culture change, whether that's a culture change designed to drive a client customer feedback outcome, whether that's a culture change designed to drive a strategic commercial outcome for the organization, any which one of those, the challenge of how do we articulate this to the manager in a way that's palatable and acceptable and sympathetic to the challenge of the modern manager, I think is everything. It's the single reason why we created our World-Class Manager program based on the modules, on the content and the way we deliver the content, was purely because we accept that the role of the manager is really tough. And interestingly, when we talk to leadership teams around the world, everyone has an expectation of the manager. The sales director has expectations of managers. The chief information officer has expectations of managers. The chief marketing officer, the chief people officer, the chief financial officer, the chief executive officer. Everyone has a desire and a demand from the role of the modern manager. So again, I think, what we can probably do here to make this as easy as possible is start to think about the world of change in the world of one. How do we get one person to want to change the way that they do things, which I think gives us a really good clue in for how we might need to focus on this across the entire organization. So that is it. We're pretty much done. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm conscious that there may be some questions coming in. So let's try and spend a few minutes on those, and then we can wrap this one up. And what we're going to aim to do is do these live streams every 2 weeks. Okay, Here we go. Right. So I'm reading this the same time as you. So let's go for it. So how do we keep colleagues curious enough to drive change, to not get lost in their environment and daily routine? How do we encourage them to challenge the norm? Well, I guess my answer to this, I don't know who this is from, but thank you very much. In terms of how we keep people curious to drive change, surely it's got something to do with something that's of interest to them. The one big thing that we know is that most human beings don't know very well in terms of what they want. That question that guy, Colonel Ed Guthrie, asked of what was supposed to happen, what actually happened, why was there a difference in between the two, and what can we do differently next time? The hardest question to agree on was what was supposed to happen. Like, what is the plan? What do I want? Which is one of the hardest things for people to agree on. So I think the role of the manager in the organization is individually to work out what people really want, which is based on the good old-fashioned one-to-one, good old-fashioned quality, regular interaction on a 3-monthly basis in a one-to-one sit down with the team to figure out what people want. And therefore, once I know what someone might want from this employment experience, from this company, from this brand, therefore I've got a good opportunity to now language something and position something in a way that's going to get them to engage because they see value in this for them. This is rapid fire. Another one's coming in. So, okay, I'm reading this at the same time as you. So how do you safely challenge senior leaders to acknowledge their behavior and response? Well, this is a good one. And behavior and responsibility for the culture of the organization. How do you safely challenge senior leaders to acknowledge their behavior? Well, I guess one thing for me would be, and I've been in this situation with an organization I worked with many years ago. There was a guy on the senior team who his behavior was abhorrent. I mean, this was one of the most difficult individuals I've ever had to work with as part of any change program in my career. Really difficult. And I went for months not challenging his behavior in the way that he spoke to me. And mainly because I couldn't figure out how to do it. I couldn't work out how to do it. And then someone said to me, because he's always talking about the values of the organization. And once I had an opportunity with him one-to-one, and I said to him out the blue, because he had no idea this was coming, I said to him, you know, how much longer do you expect me to accept how you behave and how anti the values of the organization that is? And I think it just blew him away, because I don't think anyone had ever challenged him on that. So that was a personal thing, right? So that was one thing. And you may argue that's a high risk maneuver because that could blow up. But I think it was just so important to challenge that head on. And I thought that was important to do that. And I think the other element of this is how you then build a relationship with those senior individuals. If the relation, as we know, great relationships break, are hard to break. Bad relationships break really easy. And what's the quality of the relationship like with senior people? Can you spend more time building the relationship with those people? Often the answer is yes, and it requires a bit of work on our part. And of course, it's very selfish in terms of the payoff. If I strengthen the quality of the relationship with these senior stakeholders, we all win. So I think it's worthwhile, the investment. Another question. I think this is probably going to be the last one, and then we're going to end this one. So in terms of this, during challenging times or times of restructuring, this is great too. How do we keep energy levels up and sell a positive culture to colleagues? And what a great question. What a great question. So in times of restructuring, now going back a few years, I saw 2 organizations who were going through difficult times, but managed to improve the employee engagement score as they went through these difficult times of restructuring. And when I talk about restructuring, lots of people lost their jobs. And I was always fascinated. How do you do that? How do you go through a process of restructuring and have employees feel more engaged after the process? And then I looked at those 2 companies quite intently and tried to work out what they were doing. In both organizations, I found the exact same answer. Exceptional communication. Everyone was clear on a regular basis of exactly what was happening. In a time where you're unsure, or whether there's doubt, or whether there's fear, or whether there's uncertainty, the worst thing to do is to create a communication vacuum, because we know that communication vacuums don't get filled with people sitting there thinking, oh, well, I suspect everything's going to be okay. No, of course not. The communication vacuum gets filled with fear-based stories. It's how we're designed to, I guess, operate. So what I found in these 2 organizations, where they were doing weekly briefings, even when there wasn't anything to brief on, they would say to people that there is no new updates this week, but on a weekly basis, the rigor, the discipline was exceptional, that people felt clear about what was actually happening. And most people are quite rational. It's when they're presented with the information. When there is the lack of information, things become irrational, because I fill in the blanks with fear-based stories that are usually designed to make me survive, and therefore I don't feel very good about the organization. So that concludes our session for this week, which is very important. As I said at the beginning, this is a really key one for us, so looking at culture change. It affects every organization out there. I think every manager is often placed in a difficult position where they're being, in a way, tasked with driving a culture change of some description, but often without the tools to do so. It's part of the reason why we built our World-Class Manager program, and it's part of the reason why we focus so much on these live streams, which is to try and build, in a way, more capacity for the manager. How do we help our manager populations to understand all of these key challenges in a much more broader way? Ideally, what we want to do is we want to get managers to feel as clear as possible as the CEO of the organization does. And the CEOs aren't often, they don't often have higher IQ than other people in the organization, but what they do have is a much more broader and richer context about everything. So, when it comes to driving change, how do we do that? We think that the key is, of course, the manager, and we must help the managers on that journey as well. So huge thank you. We're going to send out some more details in terms of the next live stream, which will be in about 2 weeks' time. Thank you so much from all around the world for those of you who engage with us, especially on these live streams. We really appreciate it, and also really appreciate much of the feedback that comes back too. Thank you very much. See you again. Bye-bye.